When I found the hidden compartment in Mr. Fletcher's 1987 Chevy pickup, I thought I'd discovered forgotten tools or spare parts. Instead, I uncovered a secret that broke my heart and changed how I see the world forever. My name is Brinley Hayes, and I've been covered in motor oil and grease since I was 12 years old. 2 years ago, when my grandfather passed away, he left me Hayes Auto Repair in the small town of Millbrook, Tennessee. Most people see a 24-year-old girl and assume, I don't know a carburetor from a catalytic converter. They're wrong. What they don't expect is that I see things other mechanics miss. I specialize in the impossible cases, the vehicles that other shops write off as totaled or not worth saving. There's something about bringing a dead engine back to life that feeds my soul, especially when it belongs to someone who reminds me of Pops. Maybe it's because I understand what it feels like to lose something precious. Or maybe it's because my grandfather taught me that every car carries a story worth preserving, but nothing prepared me for what I found inside that old Chevy. I'm holding a bundle of love letters tied with a faded yellow ribbon, and my hands are shaking so badly I can barely grip them. These aren't just any letters. They're addressed to a soldier who died in Vietnam 50 years ago, written by a woman who loved him with every fiber of her being. The photographs scattered across my workbench show a young couple radiating pure joy, completely unaware that their future would be stolen by war. The engagement ring in the small velvet box catches the fluorescent light of my garage, and I can't stop the tears from falling onto the concrete floor. This hidden compartment wasn't just storing objects. It was preserving a love story that time forgot, a romance that never got its happy ending. What makes this discovery even more devastating is that the veteran who brought me this truck, 78-year-old Cornelius Fletcher, has never mentioned this woman in all the stories he's shared about his son. He's been grieving alone for decades, not knowing that someone else loved his boy just as deeply. Someone who might still be alive, still wondering what happened to the soldier who promised to come home to her. I thought I was just fixing an engine, but I've stumbled onto something that could heal a broken heart or destroy what's left of it. The weight of this secret feels heavier than any transmission I've ever lifted, and I have no idea what to do with it. All I know is that my life changed the moment I pried open that hidden compartment, and there's no going back now. To understand how I ended up holding those life-changing letters, I need to take you back to where this story really begins. 2 years ago, when my grandfather Pops passed away from lung cancer, he left me more than just Hayes Auto Repair. He left me a philosophy that I've been struggling to live up to ever since. Pops wasn't just a mechanic. He was a healer who happened to work on cars. Growing up, I watched him treat every customer like family, especially the veterans who came to our shop. He'd spend hours listening to their stories while his weathered hands worked magic on their engines. "Every car tells a story, Brinley," he'd tell me while teaching me to gap spark plugs. "Our job is to listen to what they're really saying." Those words used to mean everything to me. Now they feel like a weight I can't carry. Since taking over the shop, I've been drowning. The small town of Millbrook depends on Hayes Auto Repair, but the economics don't make sense anymore. Pops charged fair prices to people who couldn't afford to pay much, and somehow he made it work. I've been trying to honor that legacy, giving discounts to elderly customers and veterans, working on cars that barely justify the cost of parts. The problem is, kindness doesn't pay the electric bill. My business partner Quentin, who's been my best friend since we were kids stealing candy from Morrison's corner store, keeps showing me the numbers. 3 months behind on rent, suppliers, calling daily, and a dwindling customer base that can't afford full-price repairs. We've had the same conversation at least a dozen times. "You can't save everyone, Bryn," he says. "Your grandfather had 40 years to build relationships. You're starting from scratch with half the budget." The worst part is that I've started to feel disconnected from the work itself. Instead of listening to the stories Pops taught me to hear, I've been going through the motions. Oil changes, brake jobs, transmission repairs, mechanical tasks that pay the bills but don't feed my soul. I'd been seriously considering selling the shop and moving to Nashville, maybe working for one of those quick lube chains where everything is about speed and profit margins. That all changed on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. I was under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's Honda when I heard the distinctive sound of an old truck struggling to stay alive. Through the rain-streaked windows of the garage, I watched a rusty 1987 Chevy pickup sputter into our parking lot, barely making it before the engine died completely. The passenger door opened first, and out stepped a young woman about my age, with kind eyes and an expression that mixed determination with worry. She hurried around to help an elderly man out of the driver's side. He moved slowly, using a wooden cane carved with military insignia, and I could see the way his granddaughter positioned herself to catch him if he stumbled. Cornelius Fletcher was 78 years old, though he looked older. His Army veteran cap sat slightly crooked on his silver head, and his hands shook with what I later learned was the early stages of Parkinson's disease. But his eyes were sharp and filled with a kind of desperate hope that I recognized immediately. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying the slow cadence of rural Tennessee, "I know this old truck ain't worth much to look at, but it's all I got left of my boy. Can you make her run again?" I wiped my hands on my coveralls and walked around the vehicle, taking in the rust spots, the sagging bumper, and the way the whole frame seemed to sag with exhaustion. Any reasonable mechanic would have quoted him more than the truck was worth and suggested he look for something newer. Instead, I heard my grandfather's voice in my head. "Listen to what they're really saying." "What happened to your son, Mr. Fletcher?" I asked gently. He looked away toward the mountains that surrounded our little town, and when he spoke, his voice carried 47 years of grief. "Vietnam took him. Donovan was 19 when he shipped out in 72. Been gone longer than he was alive, but that truck still smells like him when the heater works." His granddaughter Taviana squeezed his arm and gave me a look that said everything. This wasn't about transportation. This was about keeping a memory alive. Standing in that cold garage, watching this old veteran clutch his cane and stare at the truck that represented his deepest loss, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in months, I could hear what the car was really saying. It wasn't asking to be fixed. It was asking to be remembered. What I discovered when I popped the hood of that Chevy should have sent any sensible mechanic running. The engine block was so seized that trying to turn it by hand was like trying to move a mountain. Rust had eaten through the frame in 3 critical places, and when I tested the electrical system, half the wiring looked like it had been chewed by decades of mice and weather. The interior was held together by duct tape and prayers, with seat springs poking through vinyl that had cracked beyond repair. I spent 20 minutes crawling under that truck with a flashlight, documenting every problem, and the list kept growing. Transmission leak, shot suspension, brake lines that looked ready to snap, and a fuel tank that probably hadn't been properly cleaned since the Carter administration. In my head, I was calculating parts and labor costs that easily exceeded $3,000. Then Mr. Fletcher shuffled over to where I was working and said something that stopped me cold. "I can pay you $500, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I know it ain't much, but it's what I got left after paying for my medications this month. Social Security don't stretch like it used to. $500 wouldn't even cover the cost of a rebuilt transmission, let alone everything else this truck needed." I looked at Taviana, and I could see the embarrassment in her eyes. She knew what I knew. Her grandfather was asking for a miracle he couldn't afford. Before I could respond, Quentin appeared at my shoulder. He'd been listening from inside the shop, and I could practically feel his disapproval radiating off him like heat from an engine. "Bryn, can I talk to you for a minute?" he said, using that tone that meant we were about to have one of our serious conversations about the future of the business. We walked to the far corner of the garage, out of earshot from the Fletchers, and Quentin didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Look at the numbers," he said, pulling out his phone and showing me our bank balance. "We've got exactly $843 in the business account. We owe Morrison's Parts Supply $1,500, rent is 3 months behind, and the power company called this morning threatening to shut us off next week." I stared at the numbers, feeling that familiar knot form in my stomach. Every rational part of my brain knew he was right. "We couldn't afford to take on a charity case that would cost us more than we'd made in the last month. You can't save every sad story that walks through that door," Quentin continued. "I know you want to honor your grandfather's memory, but he never ran the business this close to bankruptcy. We need paying customers, not projects that'll put us under. But when I looked back at Mr. Fletcher, I saw something that Quentin couldn't see. The old veteran was running his weathered hand along the truck's fender with the same tenderness most people reserve for a beloved pet. His granddaughter stood beside him, and I watched her discreetly wipe away a tear when she thought no one was looking. "This truck is all I have left of Donovan," Mr. Fletcher said, not realizing we could hear him. "When he got drafted, he made me promise to take care of her until he came home. 47 years later, I'm still keeping that promise. That's when I understood what my grandfather had been trying to teach me all those years. Some repairs aren't about the machine at all. They're about healing the people who love them." I walked back over to Mr. Fletcher and extended my hand. "Sir, I'll take the job." Quentin's face went white. "Bryn, what are you doing?" I ignored him and focused on the relief flooding Fletcher's eyes. "It's going to take some time, and I'll need to work on it between other jobs, but I promise you, I'll bring her back to life." "You don't understand," Quentin said, his voice rising slightly. "We literally cannot afford this. The parts alone will cost more than he's paying." That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I'd been setting aside money from my personal account, hoping to eventually buy Quentin out and become the sole owner of the shop. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the parts we'd need. "Then I'll cover the difference," I told Quentin, watching his expression shift from disbelief to frustration. "With what money? And what happens when the next Mr. Fletcher walks in, here with another sob story and another $500? Are you going to bankrupt yourself trying to save everyone?" I didn't have a good answer for him because, honestly, I might have. All I knew was that turning away this old veteran felt like betraying everything my grandfather had stood for. More than that, something deep in my gut told me this truck held more secrets than a seized engine and rusted frame. Over the next 3 weeks, as I worked nights and weekends on that Chevy, Mr. Fletcher became a fixture in our waiting area. Every day, he'd shuffle in around noon, settle into the old vinyl chair by the window, and tell me stories about his son while I worked. Those daily visits from Mr. Fletcher became the highlight of my workdays. Every afternoon, he'd settle into that cracked vinyl chair and paint pictures of his son with his words. Donovan loved baseball and played shortstop for Millbrook High. He could fix anything with his hands, just like his father had taught him. He'd planned to take over the family farm when he got back from Vietnam, maybe start a family of his own. He used to take that truck mudding down by Miller's Creek, Fletcher told me one Thursday afternoon while I worked on rebuilding the carburetor. Come home covered head to toe in Tennessee clay, and his mama would make him hose off in the backyard before she'd let him in the house. 3 weeks into the project, I'd made progress that surprised even me. The engine was running smooth as silk after I'd completely rebuilt it from the ground up. I'd found original parts from a salvage yard in Memphis, and the bodywork was nearly complete. Every dent told a story that Fletcher helped me understand. The scratch on the tailgate came from loading hay bales. The small dent in the passenger door happened when Donovan's dog Rex got too excited and jumped against it. But it was the interior work that led to my life-changing discovery. I'd been putting off replacing the seat covers because the originals were so deteriorated they were falling apart in my hands. When I finally started removing them, I noticed something odd about the driver's seat. It sat slightly higher than the passenger seat, and when I pressed down on it, there was a strange give to the padding that didn't feel right. Most people would have just assumed the springs were shot, but my grandfather had taught me to pay attention to details that didn't make sense. "If something feels wrong, Brinley, it usually is wrong," he used to say. "Cars don't lie to you the way people sometimes do." I spent an entire evening after closing time examining that seat. When I removed the cover completely and looked at the frame, I could see that someone had modified it. There were extra metal brackets welded to the underside, and the padding wasn't factory standard. It looked like custom work, the kind someone would do if they were trying to hide something. My heart started beating faster as I realized what I might be looking at. During Vietnam, soldiers sometimes created hidden compartments in their personal vehicles to store important documents or valuables. I'd heard stories from other veterans who'd brought their cars to my grandfather's shop over the years. Using a small pry bar, I carefully worked around the edges of what I now suspected was a false bottom. The metal gave way with a soft click, and suddenly I was staring into a hidden compartment that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. My hands were shaking as I reached inside and felt the crinkle of plastic. I pulled out a waterproof pouch, the kind military personnel use to protect important documents from moisture and damage. The weight of it told me there was something substantial inside. I should have stopped right there. I should have called Mr. Fletcher and let him open it himself. But curiosity and the certainty that this discovery could be important made me carefully unseal the pouch. The first thing I saw was a bundle of letters tied with a faded yellow ribbon. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, the kind people used for special occasions back in the 1970s. The return address was written in careful feminine handwriting. Miss Celeste Morrison, 412 Maple Street, Clarksville, Tennessee. But it was the name in the center of each envelope that made my breath catch. My dearest Donovan. Beneath the letters were photographs. Black and white images of a young soldier in dress uniform standing next to a beautiful woman with long dark hair and eyes that sparkled with joy. They were clearly in love, the kind of love that radiates from old photographs and makes you believe in fairy tales. The last item in the pouch was a small velvet jewelry box. When I opened it, I found an engagement ring with a delicate band and a modest but beautiful diamond. Tucked inside the lid was a note written in the same feminine handwriting. For when you come home to me, forever yours, Celeste. I sat in that quiet garage for an hour, staring at these artifacts of a love story that time had forgotten. In all the hours Mr. Fletcher had spent telling me about his son, he'd never once mentioned a girlfriend or fiancé. Never talked about anyone named Celeste who might have been waiting for Donovan to come home. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This woman, whoever she was, had loved Donovan Fletcher enough to give him her heart and a promise of marriage. She'd waited for him while he was overseas, writing letters that he'd hidden away like treasures. And somehow, when he died in Vietnam, that connection had been lost. I was holding evidence of a love story that Mr. Fletcher knew nothing about. I didn't sleep that night. I kept staring at the ceiling, thinking about those letters and the woman who'd written them with such love and hope. By morning, I'd made a decision that terrified and excited me in equal measure. I had to find Celeste Morrison. The return address on the letters was over 50 years old, but it was a starting point. I spent my lunch break at the Millbrook Public Library, using their computer to search for any trace of her. Social media, public records, anything that might tell me if she was still alive. What I found made my heart race. Celeste Morrison had become Celeste Wright in 1975, 3 years after Donovan died. She was 75 years old now, widowed since 2018, and living in Hartsville, just 2 towns over from us. Her Facebook page was maintained by her daughter, and there were photos of family gatherings, grandchildren, and a life fully lived. But it was one particular photo that made me gasp out loud. In that quiet library, posted just 6 months ago on what would have been her 75th birthday, there was a picture of Celeste standing next to her fireplace mantel. And there, clearly visible among the family photos, was a black and white picture of a young soldier in dress uniform. The caption read, "Mom still keeps a photo of her first love on the mantel. She says some people never leave your heart, even after 50 years. I screenshot that post with trembling fingers, knowing I was looking at proof that Celeste had never forgotten Donovan Fletcher. But I also realized the devastating truth. She'd waited for him, not knowing he was already dead, and by the time she learned the truth, she'd moved on with her life. She'd married someone else, had children, built a family, all while carrying the memory of the boy who never came home. The next part of my investigation broke my heart even more. I found Donovan's military records online and discovered he'd been killed in an ambush near Da Nang in November 1972. But the Army's notification to his family had taken weeks to process, and during that time, Celeste had kept writing letters to a dead soldier. Her last letter, dated December 15, 1972, was heartbreaking. She wrote about Christmas plans, about the wedding they'd discussed, about how she was learning to cook his favorite meal for when he came home. She had no idea that by the time she mailed that letter, Donovan had already been buried in Arlington National Cemetery. I realized that Mr. Fletcher probably did receive notification of her existence at some point. The Army would have forwarded her letters or mentioned her in their casualty reports. But in his grief, overwhelmed by losing his only child, he'd likely dismissed or forgotten about the young woman who'd loved his son. For 3 days, I wrestled with whether to tell him. Quentin was right when he said some secrets might be meant to stay buried. What if learning about Celeste made Mr. Fletcher's grief worse? What if he blamed himself for not reaching out to her 50 years ago? What if the knowledge that someone else had loved Donovan as much as he did felt like a betrayal somehow? But then I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me when I was struggling with a difficult repair. Sometimes, Brinley, the hardest thing to fix is also the most important thing to fix. Don't let fear keep you from doing what's right. On Friday afternoon, when Mr. Fletcher came for his daily visit, I asked him to sit down. The restored truck gleamed behind me, finally ready for its reveal, but that seemed insignificant compared to what I was about to share. "Mr. Fletcher," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I found something while working on Donovan's truck, something I think you need to see." I placed the waterproof pouch on the table between us and watched his face change as I explained what I'd discovered. His weathered hands shook as he reached for the bundle of letters, and when he saw Celeste's name written in that careful script, his eyes filled with tears. "I remember her now," he whispered, holding one of the photographs. Donovan mentioned a girl named Celeste in his letters home. Said he was going to marry her when the war was over. But after he died, I was so consumed with my own grief that I forgot. She wrote to me once, right after the funeral. But I was too angry at the world to respond, too broken to think about anyone else's pain. He looked up at me with eyes full of regret. "Do you think she's still alive?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the Facebook post with Celeste standing beside her mantle. When he saw that photo of his son still holding a place of honor in another person's home after all these years, he broke down completely. "She never forgot him," he sobbed. "All these years, I thought I was the only one keeping his memory alive, but she never forgot him either. That's when I knew what I had to do." "Mr. Fletcher, would you like to meet her?" It took me 3 phone calls to work up the courage to contact Celeste's daughter. When I finally explained who I was and why I was calling, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she said something that gave me chills. "My mother has been waiting for this call her entire life." The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at my shop. I spent the entire morning cleaning and polishing that 1987 Chevy until it gleamed like the day it rolled off the factory floor. When Celeste arrived, driven by her daughter, I watched through the window as she slowly got out of the car and stared at the truck. Even at 75, I could see traces of the beautiful young woman from those photographs. Her hair was silver now, and she moved with the careful grace of someone who'd lived a full life, but her eyes were the same. When she saw that truck, her hand went to her heart, and I knew she was seeing it exactly as it had looked 50 years ago. Mr. Fletcher was already inside, sitting in his usual chair, more nervous than I'd ever seen him. When Celeste walked through the door, they looked at each other with a mixture of recognition and wonder, as if they were seeing ghosts made real. "Cornelius?" she said softly, and the way she pronounced his name told me she'd thought about this moment countless times over the decades. "Hello, Celeste," he replied, struggling to stand with his cane. "I'm sorry it took me 50 years to call you back." What happened next was the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. These 2 people, both carrying half a century of grief, found comfort in sharing their memories of the boy they'd both loved. Celeste told stories I'd never heard. How Donovan had proposed to her at Miller's Creek, the same place where he used to take the truck mudding. How he'd hidden the engagement ring in her grandmother's rose garden and made her search for it while he laughed. "He said he wanted our whole life to feel like a treasure hunt," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I kept all his letters in a hope chest for 10 years, thinking somehow he'd come home and we'd read them together." Mr. Fletcher shared memories that Celeste had never heard. How Donovan practiced his proposal speech in the barn for weeks. How he'd saved every penny from his part-time job to buy that ring. How the night before he shipped out, He'd sat in that truck for hours, just thinking about the future they'd planned. He loved you more than life itself, Mr. Fletcher told her. In his letters home, he wrote about you constantly, said you were the reason he was fighting so hard to come back. They spent 4 hours in that garage, filling in the pieces of Donovan's story that each had been missing. When it was time for Celeste to leave, Mr. Fletcher walked her to the truck one more time. "I have something that belongs to you," he said, pulling out the velvet ring box from the hidden compartment. "He meant for you to have this." Celeste held that ring for a long time, then carefully placed it back in his hands. "Keep it," she said, "but know that I never stopped loving him. My husband was a good man who understood that some loves are so deep they become part of who you are. Donovan will always live in my heart." Before they parted, they exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. As I watched Mr. Fletcher's granddaughter help him into the truck he'd insisted I keep, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "You gave me back my son's memory and found me a friend I thought I'd lost forever," he said. "That truck brought us all together for a reason." 6 months later, Mr. Fletcher and Celeste meet every Tuesday at the diner on Main Street. They're both healthier and happier than they've been in years, no longer carrying their grief alone. My shop has become known throughout Tennessee as the place that specializes in vehicles with sentimental value, and I've never been busier or more fulfilled. But the most important thing I learned from that hidden compartment isn't about engines or restoration. It's about the stories we carry and the healing that happens when we're brave enough to share them. Every car that comes into my shop now gets the same careful attention, because I've learned that sometimes the most important repairs aren't mechanical at all. That 1987 Chevy sits in my personal garage now, a reminder that love stories never really end. They just wait patiently to be discovered by someone willing to listen. If this story touched your heart the way it changed mine, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about the connections that make us human. And remember, the next time someone brings you their most treasured possession, look deeper. You might just find a piece of their soul.